They told him to sit down. They told him to stay quiet. They said, "You're too young to lead, too bold to survive." But what happens when a man refuses to bow? In a world ruled by silent puppets and polished speeches, one voice rose, not to please, not to obey, but to defy. At just 35 years old, he didn't ask for permission. He took a stand against the powers of France, against the influence of America, against the system that's been draining Africa for generations. This is not just a story about politics. This is not just a tale of one country. This is a fire, a revolution of the mind. Because when one man dares to challenge the empire, he lights a path for millions to follow. So don't blink, don't scroll away, because what you're about to hear isn't just a speech. It's a wake-up call. And by the end, you'll understand why the world is watching Ibrahim Traoré and why you should too. Let's begin. At just 34 years old, Ibrahim Traoré rose to power in Burkina Faso, becoming the youngest head of state, not just in his country, but across the entire African continent at the time. His ascent wasn't the result of years of political grooming or international backing. It was the result of boldness, frustration, and a deep desire for change. Traore wasn't a career politician. He was a soldier, a captain in the army, someone who had walked the dusty roads of Burkina Faso, who had seen firsthand the insecurity, the fear, the instability that had gripped his nation. What made his story different is that he wasn't willing to just sit and wait for someone else to fix it. He stood up, even if it meant risking everything. Burkina Faso had been plagued by violence for years, with extremist attacks, displacement, and a government that seemed increasingly disconnected from the pain of the people. The previous leadership had failed to bring peace. Towns were being seized, families were running for their lives, and young children were growing up knowing nothing but war. Ibrahim Traoré didn't just see this as a military issue. He saw it as a betrayal of the people. He watched his comrades die, his country collapse, and promises fade into excuses. And when he realized that waiting any longer would only deepen the wounds, he made a decision. In September 2022, Traoré led a coup d'etat, removing Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, who had himself come to power only months earlier in a separate coup. To many, it seemed like just another chapter in a cycle of instability. But to the people of Burkina Faso, especially the youth, Traoré was different. He wasn't just another man in uniform. He was young, bold, and uncompromising. He spoke the language of urgency. He didn't make political speeches crafted by advisors. He spoke from the heart, from the trenches, and from a place of genuine frustration with a system that had failed the people over and over again. What makes his rise even more significant is the context in which it happened. Burkina Faso, like many former French colonies in Africa, had long been tied to France through political, economic, and military dependencies. The French military presence, though framed as a partnership, was increasingly seen by locals as ineffective and even unwanted. People felt that their sovereignty was being diluted, that their freedom was symbolic but not real. Traoré didn't tiptoe around this reality. He called it out. He became a voice for a new generation of Africans who weren't afraid to say, we want to lead ourselves, defend ourselves, and define ourselves. The people rallied around him, not just because he took power, but because of what he represented. He became a symbol of youth power, of anti-imperialist resistance, and of hope. In a continent where older leaders often cling to power for decades, Traore stood out simply by being young and unafraid to disrupt the norm. He reminded many of Thomas Sankara, the legendary Burkinabe leader who once inspired a whole continent before being assassinated. Like Sankara, Traore spoke of dignity, independence, and unity. Like Sankara, he wore simplicity like armor. And like Sankara, he knew that standing up to powerful forces wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. His youth became his weapon. Where others saw inexperience, he brought energy. Where others preached diplomacy, he brought clarity. Where others tried to please international allies, he chose to speak directly to his people. That boldness made him dangerous to some and heroic to others. In just a matter of weeks, he became a national icon, not because he had won an election, but because he had won trust. The kind of trust that comes not from polished suits and press releases, but from walking through fire and not backing down. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership became a turning point in the fight against neo-colonial influence in West Africa, particularly targeting the long-standing dominance of France. For decades, France maintained a powerful presence in its former colonies through military agreements, economic control, language, and political influence. These relationships were often framed as partnerships or alliances, but to many Africans, including Traoré, they represented a continued chain of dependency and interference. When he assumed power in Burkina Faso, Traoré wasted no time in signaling a new direction, one that no longer bowed to the pressure or expectations of foreign powers, especially France. Under previous administrations, French troops had been stationed in Burkina Faso as part of Operation Barkhane, a counterterrorism initiative led by France across the Sahel region. The mission's goal was to combat the rising tide of extremist violence and support local governments in maintaining security. But to many citizens, the presence of French forces had done little to improve the situation. Attacks continued, lives were lost, towns were overrun. People began to question why, after years of French military aid and presence, the crisis was only getting worse. Instead of protection, they saw occupation. Instead of cooperation, they saw control. And Traoré saw that anger building in the streets, in the villages, and even within the military ranks. He understood that the narrative of fighting terrorism was often used to mask deeper intentions, access to resources, political leverage, and the ability to shape African destinies from European boardrooms. Burkina Faso, rich in gold and other natural resources, had long been exploited through deals that benefited foreign corporations far more than the local economy. Traoré challenged this imbalance head-on. He publicly criticized the nature of these so-called partnerships and demanded that Burkina Faso be allowed to take control of its own affairs without foreign interference. His speeches were fiery, direct, and unapologetic. He spoke not just as a leader of a nation, but as a voice for a continent tired of being dictated to. The climax of this bold stance came when he ordered the withdrawal of French troops from Burkinabe soil. He also expelled the French ambassador and terminated military agreements that allowed foreign troops to operate within the country. These moves weren't just symbolic, they were revolutionary. They declared that Burkina Faso would no longer be a playground for foreign powers. The world watched closely. Critics warned of isolation, but to the people of Burkina Faso, it was a reclaiming of dignity. Traoré was doing what many had only whispered about for years, standing up to a global power and saying enough. This anti-imperialist stance wasn't limited to speeches or gestures. Traoré began redirecting national priorities. He emphasized homegrown solutions to security, development, and governance. He encouraged citizens to support their own military, to rely on internal strength rather than external saviors. He highlighted how decades of external dependency had eroded confidence and stifled true progress. The message was clear: liberation doesn't come from handouts or advisors in foreign embassies. It comes from within, from courage, from unity, from the willingness to break chains that have been disguised as gifts. His defiance sent shockwaves beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa, especially in Mali, Niger, and other Sahel countries, young people and political movements began to rally around the idea of self-determination. Traore became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that sovereignty means nothing if it is only written on paper but not practiced in reality. His decisions reignited conversations about what it truly means to be independent in a global system where influence can be more powerful than occupation. And he showed through action and not just rhetoric that challenging empires is not only possible, it is necessary. After breaking away from France's grip, Ibrahim Traoré began shifting Burkina Faso's geopolitical direction toward new global alliances, particularly strengthening ties with Russia and other non-Western powers. This wasn't just a reactionary move, it was a calculated decision to redefine the country's place in the global order. For decades, African nations had been taught to look toward the West for aid, guidance, and legitimacy, but Traoré challenged that model. He believed that true sovereignty required more than the absence of foreign troops. It demanded independence in diplomacy, economics, and security. And to achieve that, he had to look beyond the traditional Western sphere of influence. Russia had already begun making inroads in Africa, particularly in countries like Mali and the Central African Republic, which, like Burkina Faso, had grown weary of French and American involvement. Traoré saw an opportunity to diversify alliances and build partnerships not based on historical guilt or colonial legacy, but on mutual interest and respect. He opened diplomatic channels with Moscow, welcomed military cooperation, and showed openness to working with nations that did not come with a colonial past in West Africa. These new relationships allowed Burkina Faso to explore military assistance, arms deals, and security support without the usual strings attached by Western powers. This shift was about more than geopolitics. It was psychological. Traoré was telling his people and the world that Burkina Faso was capable of choosing its own friends, writing its own foreign policy, and deciding who could or could not be trusted. The reliance on one power bloc had long left African nations vulnerable. If aid was cut, their systems crumbled. If foreign troops left, insecurity rose. Traoré wanted to end that cycle. He believed that if the West viewed Burkina Faso only as a place to fight terrorism or extract resources, then it was time to find partners who respected its sovereignty and were willing to cooperate without domination. His move toward Russia and other non-aligned nations sent a message that Burkina Faso was not afraid to challenge the status quo. And while critics in the West raised alarms, accusing Traoré of endangering democracy or aligning with autocracies, many Burkinabés saw the change as empowering. They weren't looking for perfect allies, they were looking for freedom to choose. Traoré made it clear that Burkina Faso would no longer tolerate being used as a pawn in international power game. If partnerships were to be made, they would be on terms defined by the Burkina people, not dictated from Paris. As part of this reorientation, Traoré also began exploring regional solidarity. He supported stronger ties with neighboring Sahel nations like Mali and Niger, which were also distancing themselves from Western influence. Together, these nations envisioned a new regional bloc, one where African countries could support one another militarily, economically, and politically, without being at the mercy of foreign interests. This growing alliance aimed to pool resources, share intelligence, and even envision a future economic integration free from Western-controlled financial systems. This shift in alliances was bold and risky, but Traoré knew that playing it safe would mean continuing a legacy of dependence. He wanted to show his people that they didn't have to beg for security, development, or recognition. They could build it through unity, courage, and new alliances that respected their dignity. His actions inspired debates across Africa, encouraging other leaders and activists to rethink their country's foreign alliance. He reignited the belief that Africa could carve out its own path, one rooted in strength, not submission. In choosing a new direction, Traoré wasn't just changing Burkina Faso's alliances, he was challenging the global hierarchy that had long dictated who gets to lead and who must follow. One of the most defining features of Ibrahim Traoré's leadership is his commitment to youth empowerment and his symbolic representation of a new generation rising up against decades of oppression, manipulation, and foreign dependency. At just 35 years old, Traoré became the world's youngest head of state. But what truly set him apart was not just his age. It was his mindset. He didn't walk into power trying to mimic the leaders before him. He came in to challenge a broken system that had kept young people voiceless, unemployed, and disillusioned. In a region where elders traditionally dominate politics and power often passes through the same recycled elite, his emergence was a thunderstorm that disrupted everything. Traoré's rise wasn't polished or pre-planned. He came from the military, not the elite circles of diplomacy or finance that gave him a raw authenticity, a connection to the struggles of ordinary citizens, especially the youth. He knew what it meant to come from nothing. He understood the frustration of young people who watched their futures traded away in backroom deals and foreign contracts. He had seen the anger on the streets and the despair in the eyes of young men holding diplomas but no jobs, dreams but no opportunities. And instead of silencing that rage, he gave it a voice. He began reshaping the national conversation. Instead of telling young people to wait their turn or respect the old ways, he told them their time was now. He encouraged youth to get involved, not just in politics, but in rebuilding the nation, militarily, economically, and socially. He empowered them to stand for something greater than survival. In his speeches and public appearances, he spoke directly to the young generation, urging them to take ownership of their country and never again let foreign powers dictate their destiny. It wasn't about rebellion for the sake of chaos. It was about revolution for the sake of justice. Traoré led by example. He didn't sit behind palace walls surrounded by bureaucrats in suits. He was seen among the people, in military fatigue, standing shoulder to shoulder with soldiers on the front lines, walking through the streets where gunfire had echoed just days before. This wasn't political theater. It was leadership rooted in presence and courage. And for a generation that had been told to stay quiet, stay humble, and stay in line, his example was electrifying. It shattered the belief that change could only come from above or from foreign NGOs. He proved that a young African, unpolished and unapologetic, could lead with purpose and power. This deep connection to the youth turned into a movement. Across Burkina Faso, young people began organizing, not in protest, but in participation. They joined local defense groups. They volunteered for civic programs. They started conversations about self-reliance, identity, and dignity. Traoré didn't just empower them, he challenged them. He reminded them that freedom wasn't free and that real change required sacrifice, discipline, and unity. The old leaders had looked to the West for solutions. Traoré looked into the eyes of his people, and saw the solution staring back. What makes this transformation so powerful is that it wasn't orchestrated in some high-level strategy room. It was born out of truth, struggle, and conviction. Traore became a mirror for millions of African youth, proof that age doesn't disqualify leadership and that courage doesn't come with permission. His leadership is a challenge to the entire continent to stop waiting for saviors and start becoming them. In a world that often doubts the capability of African youth, he stood up and showed what happens when one of them decides to lead, not follow, fight, not flee, and rise, not beg. One of the most striking aspects of Ibrahim Traoré's rise and leadership is his fierce resistance to imperialism in all its forms, not just military or economic, but also cultural. In a world where colonization has evolved into more subtle systems of control, Traoré has made it his mission to expose and dismantle these modern chains that keep nations like Burkina Faso dependent, distracted, and disempowered. For decades, Western powers have maintained influence over African nations, not only through foreign troops and exploitative trade agreements, but also through the dominance of Western narratives, languages, education systems, and even aspirations. Traoré saw this for what it was, a new form of colonization, no longer carried out with armies and flags, but with banks, media, and foreign policies dressed in the language of democracy and development. He didn't just reject the visible presence of French troops or American military cooperation. He rejected the ideology that came with them, the belief that Africa could not survive or thrive without the West. The assumption that African solutions must be approved by European standards. He questioned everything from the language taught in schools to the foreign aid packages wrapped in fine print. To Traoré, every piece of external influence carried a price, and more often than not, that price was sovereignty. He challenged the deep psychological conditioning that had made generations of Africans believe that progress meant copying the West, that development could only be measured by how closely a country mirrored its former colonizers. That belief system, he argued, was far more dangerous than any military occupation. Traoré began by calling out the double standards of international diplomacy. He highlighted how Western nations preached democracy, yet supported coups or dictators when it suited their interests, how they spoke of peace, yet armed factions and sold weapons into conflict zones. He wasn't afraid to name names or point fingers. And unlike most African leaders who had grown cautious, diplomatic, or submissive in the face of Western critique, Traoré was bold and unapologetic. His speeches did not come from a place of bitterness. They came from clarity, from the understanding that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and that true leadership means speaking up even when it's dangerous. But resisting imperialism wasn't just about cutting ties, it was about rebuilding identity. Traoré emphasized the importance of reclaiming African heritage, culture, and pride. He encouraged the use of local languages, the celebration of indigenous knowledge systems, and the rewriting of history books that had long painted colonialism as a civilizing mission. He wanted Burkina Faso children to grow up knowing that their ancestors were not passive victims, but warriors, builders, and visionaries, that Africa's past was not a tale of defeat, but of resilience. This cultural awakening was not ornamental. It was strategic, because a people who do not know who they are can easily be told who to become. Traoré's resistance to imperialism wasn't about hatred, it was about justice, about self-respect, about refusing to be treated as less than human on the global stage. He believed that Burkina Faso could cooperate with the world without surrendering its soul, that it could trade without being exploited, that it could defend itself without foreign soldiers on its soil. He was willing to risk international backlash because he knew that freedom was never given. It had to be claimed. His actions reignited conversations across Africa, especially among the youth, about what it truly means to be independent. And in standing firm, even under pressure, Traoré reminded the world that Africa is not a chessboard for foreign powers, but a continent of sovereign nations ready to write their own future. One of the boldest and most controversial moves Ibrahim Traoré made was his effort to cut military and economic ties with France and America while simultaneously building new alliances with powers like Russia and others that were traditionally viewed with suspicion by the West. This was not done impulsively or out of emotion. It was a calculated response to decades of unbalanced partnerships that left Burkina Faso dependent and vulnerable. For years, French military presence in the Sahel was justified by the need to fight terrorism, yet terrorism grew worse. Billions in aid were poured in, but development stagnated. Promises were made, but sovereignty was continuously compromised. Traoré saw through the illusion and made a choice that many before him feared to even voice. He would no longer allow his country to be a playground for foreign agendas. When he ordered French troops to leave and began questioning the role of American involvement in the region, it sent shockwaves across the diplomatic world. Critics rushed to label him reckless, unstable, even radical. But to the people of Burkina Faso, especially the youth, he was doing what many had dreamed of but never believed was possible. He was standing up. He was asserting a vision of Burkina Faso that didn't include being a satellite state. That act of courage shifted the narrative. He was no longer just a soldier turned leader. He became a symbol of defiance against neo-colonial control. But cutting ties is only half the equation. Traoré knew that removing one foreign influence without building alternatives could lead to chaos. That's why he pursued strategic partnerships elsewhere, not from a place of desperation, but from a desire to balance power. In a world where smaller nations are often forced to choose sides in global rivalries, Traoré chose his people. He opened dialogue with Russia and other non-Western nations, exploring new avenues for defense cooperation, infrastructure projects, and technological exchange. He wasn't seeking a new master. He was building a network. And that distinction matters, because for far too long, African countries have been caught in cycles of dependency where every solution came with strings attached. His engagement with new powers was rooted in a clear message. Burkina Faso would no longer accept partnerships that undermine its dignity or independence. He didn't care about pleasing Washington or Paris. He cared about protecting his soil, his people, and their right to self-determination. By diversifying his country's alliances, he created room for negotiation, room for resistance, and room for growth on Burkina Faso's own terms. That terrified those who had grown comfortable with African nations being predictable, pliable, and perpetually indebted. This realignment wasn't just geopolitical, it was psychological. It gave the people of Burkina Faso and many across Africa a renewed sense of pride. They were no longer watching their leaders beg on international stages. They were seeing a young man speak boldly, act decisively, and demand respect. That shift in posture, standing tall instead of bowing low, was revolutionary, because in a world designed to keep certain nations at the margins, changing your stance is the first step toward changing your fate. Ibrahim Traoré's approach challenges the very foundation of international relations as they've existed in Africa for decades. It questions who gets to define legitimacy, who gets to offer help, and under what terms. It forces a reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that much of what is called cooperation has often been quiet control. By breaking away from traditional Western alliances and choosing to build new ones, Traore redefined what leadership in Africa could look like, not reactive, not submissive, but proactive, strategic, and unapologetically sovereign. Ibrahim Traoré did not rise to power to become another figurehead. He rose to challenge a system that for too long has stolen the voice of his people. He saw the illusion of freedom and shattered it. He saw the chains of foreign aid and broke them. At just 35 years old, he stood not just against military oppression, but against decades of psychological warfare, economic exploitation, and cultural erasure. He reminded the world, and more importantly, he reminded Africa, that dignity is not negotiable and sovereignty is not a favor to be granted. Whether you agree with every move he's made or not, one thing is certain. He has reignited the spirit of resistance, the hunger for self-determination, and the belief that the continent of Africa is not weak, not poor, and not broken. It has simply been shackled. And now, men like Ibrahim Traoré are breaking those chains, one decision at a time. To every listener, viewer, and seeker of truth, thank you for taking the time to witness this message. May you carry the fire of awareness into your own lives, your own nations, and your own hearts. Stand tall, speak truth, and never forget. Real change begins when ordinary people choose to walk with extraordinary courage. Good luck on your journey, and may your voice never tremble in the face of injustice. Thank you.